To Nature, Culture, Writing, Introduction to the Age of Rousseau. I felt as if I had been guilty of incest. He Confessions of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Introduction to the Age of Rousseau. In the voice we have an organ answering to hearing, we have no such organ answering to sight, and we do not repeat colors as we repeat sounds. This supplies an additional means of cultivating the ear by practicing the active and passive organs one with the other. If one had faith in the organization of a classical reading, one would perhaps say that I had just proposed a double grid, historical and systematic. Let us pretend to believe in this opposition. Let us do it for the sake of convenience, for I hope that the reasons for my suspicion are by now clear enough. Since I am about to deal with what, using the same language and with as much caution, I call an example, I must now justify my choice. Why accord an exemplary value to the Age of Rousseau? What privileged place does Jean-Jacques Rousseau occupy in the history of logocentrism? What is meant by that proper name? And what are the relationships between that proper name and the texts to which it was underwritten? I do not profess to bring to these questions anything more than the beginning of an answer, perhaps only the beginning of an elaboration, limited to the preliminary organization of the question. This work will present itself gradually. I cannot therefore justify it by way of anticipation and preface. Let us nevertheless attempt an overture. If the history of metaphysics is the history of a determination of being as presence, if its adventure merges with that of logocentrism, and if it is produced wholly as the reduction of the trace, Rousseau's work seems to me to occupy, between Plato's Phaedrus and Hegel's Encyclopedia, a singular position. What do these three landmarks signify? Between the overture and the philosophical accomplishment of phonologism, or logocentrism, the motif of presence was decisively articulated. It underwent an internal modification whose most conspicuous index was the moment of certitude in the Cartesian cogito. Before that, the identity of presence offered to the mastery of repetition was constituted under the objective form of the ideality of the eidos or the substantiality of ousia. Thereafter, this objectivity takes the form of representation, of the idea as the modification of a self-present substance, conscious and certain of itself at the moment of its relationship to itself. Within its most general form, the mastery of presence acquires a sort of infinite assurance. The power of repetition that the eidos and ousia made available seems to acquire an absolute independence. Ideality and substantiality relate to themselves, in the element of the residential cogitans by a movement of pure auto-affection. Consciousness is the experience of pure auto-affection. It calls itself infallible, and if the axioms of natural reason give it this certitude, overcome the provocation of the evil spirit, and prove the existence of God, it is because they constitute the very element of thought and of self-presence. Self-presence is not disturbed by the divine origin of these axioms. The infinite aldirity of the divine substance does not interpose itself as an element of mediation or opacity in the transparence of self-relationship and the purity of auto-affection. God is the name and the element of that which makes possible an absolutely pure and absolutely self-present self-knowledge. From Descartes to Hegel, and in spite of all the differences that separate the different places and moments in the structure of that epoch, God's infinite understanding is the other name for the logos as self-presence. The logos can be infinite and self-present, it can be produced as auto-affection, only through the voice, an order of the signifier by which the subject takes from itself into itself, does not borrow outside of itself the signifier that it emits and that affects it at the same time. Such is at least the experience or consciousness of the voice, of hearing, understanding, oneself speak as entendre parler. That experience lives and proclaims itself as the exclusion of writing, that is to say of the invoking of an exterior, sensible, spatial signifier interrupting self-presence. Within this age of metaphysics, between Descartes and Hegel, Rousseau is undoubtedly the only one or the first one to make a theme or a system of the reduction of writing profoundly implied by the entire age. He repeats the inaugural movement of the Phaedrus and of de interpretation, but starts from a new model of presence, the subject self-presence within consciousness or feeling. What he excluded more violently than others must, of course, have fascinated and tormented him more than it did others. Descartes had driven out the sign, and particularly the written sign, from the cogito and from clear and distinct evidence, the latter being the very presence of the idea to the soul. The sign was an accessory abandoned in the region of the senses and of the imagination. Hegel reappropriates the sensible sign to the movement of the idea. He criticizes Leibniz and praises phonetic writing within the horizon of an absolutely self-present logos, remaining close to itself within the unity of its speech and its concept. But neither Descartes nor Hegel grappled with the problem of writing. The place of this combat and crisis is called the 18th century. Not only because it restores the rights of sensibility, the imagination, and the sign, but because attempts of the Leibnizian type had opened a breach within logocentric security. We must bring to light what it was that, write I Introduction to the Age of Rousseau 99 from the start, within these attempts at a universal characteristic, limited the power and extent of the breakthrough. Before Hegel, and in explicit terms, Rousseau condemned the universal characteristic, not because the theological foundation which ordained its possibility for the infinite understanding or logos of God, but because it seemed to suspend the voice. Through this condemnation can be read the most energetic 18th century reaction organizing the defense of phonologism and of logocentric metaphysics. What threatens is indeed writing. It is not an accidental and haphazard threat, it reconciles within a single historical system the projects of passigraphy, the discovery of non-European scripts, or at any rate the massive progress of the techniques of deciphering, and finally the idea of a general science of language and writing. Against all these pressures, a battle is then declared. Hegelianism will be its finest scar. The names of authors or of doctrines have here no substantial value. They indicate neither identities nor causes. It would be frivolous to think that Descartes, Leibniz, Rousseau, Hegel, etc., are names of the authors of movements or displacements that we thus designate. The indicative value that I attribute to them is first the name of a problem. If I provision all authorize myself to treat this historical structure by fixing my attention on philosophical or literary texts, it is not for the sake of identifying in them the origin, cause, or equilibrium of the structure. But as I also do not think that these texts are the simple effects of structure, in any sense of the word, as I think that all concepts hitherto proposed in order to think the articulation of a discourse and of an historical totality are caught within the metaphysical closure that I question here, as we do not know of any other concepts and cannot produce any others, and indeed shall not produce so long as this closure limits our discourse, as the primordial and indispensable phase. In fact and in principle, of the development of this problematic, consists in questioning the internal structure of these texts as symptoms, as that is the only condition for determining these symptoms themselves in the totality of their metaphysical appurtenance. I draw my argument from them in order to isolate Rousseau, and, in Rousseauism, the theory of writing. Besides, this abstraction is partial and it remains, in my view, provisional. Further on, I shall directly approach the problem within a question of method. Beyond these broad and preliminary justifications, other urgencies should be invoked. In Western and notably French thought, the dominant discourse, let us call it structuralism, remains caught, by an entire layer, sometimes the most fecund, of its stratification, within the metaphysics logocentrism which at the same time one claims rather precipitately to have gone beyond. If I have chosen the example of the texts of Claude Lévi-Strauss, as points of departure and as a springboard for a reading of Rousseau, it is for more than one reason, for the theoretical wealth and interest of those texts, for the animating role that they currently play, but also for the place occupied in them by the theory of writing and the theme of fidelity to Rousseau. They will, therefore, in this study, be somewhat more than an exergue.